Well, welcome back, folks, to another episode of the American Civil War. We have been talking about the Civil War for the last few months, and we are finishing up with 1862 today. So we're about not quite halfway through, but you know, pretty close. Let's kind of review what we talked about last week. Big events last week. We looked at the events that took place after the Second Battle of Bull Run. Remember, the first one took place in July of 1861, and the second one took place about 13 months later. We saw how Robert E. Lee, after defeating McClellan down in Virginia at the Battle of the uh, 7 Days, decided to head north and pushed his army up into Virginia, battled, Polk at the Battle of Bull Run, defeated him, and then he decided he was going to head further up north into Maryland. His intent was hopefully to create enough animosity in Maryland that they would join with him in the Confederacy. Maryland was one of those four border states, along with Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri. And Maryland was the one that he really hoped he could get into the Confederacy. He'd given up on Missouri pretty much, and he still had hopes for Kentucky, but they were dwindling. He also wanted to affect the off-year elections. Remember, this is 1862. That means the Congress and the Senate are going to be elected, along with some governorships and all. And he was hoping that he would be able to discourage enough of the Republicans that they would be defeated, and as a result, maybe some of what was called peace Democrats would come into the government and maybe make peace with the Confederacy. He had all sorts of hopes playing on this offensive going up into Maryland. But things went sideways with him because somewhere along the line, one of his lieutenants, we don't know which one, there were five different lieutenants or generals that were given orders about how to proceed up to Maryland. He divided his army into five smaller armies so they could live off the land and maybe be not as detected. Somewhere along the line, his orders, one of them got lost and was found by a corporal in the Union Army. Of course, he realized what he had, got it to McClellan, and McClellan was just overjoyed. He thought, "Man, I have got it. If I can't whip Bobby Lee, I'm going to go home," he said. Well, so he heads north, McClellan does. He knows exactly where Lee is. He knows Lee's army is divided into five parts, and he has got him like outnumbered like 5-1 if he can catch him. I mean, it was just a really stroke of good luck. They would meet in September 17th at outside of Sharpsburg, Maryland, in a little battle called Battle of Antietam Creek. That's how it's basically known. Again, remember, most of these battles have two names. Sometimes they're known as the Union name, sometimes they're known as the Confederate name. This is one of those that's pretty much known by the Battle of Antietam. Some people still call it the Battle of Sharpsburg. For the most part, it's the Battle of Antietam. It would be the bloodiest battle of the Civil War. It was not the biggest, you know. Maybe it wasn't the most important, but it was most certainly one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War. The casualties surmounted combined more than the War of 1812, the Mexican War, and the Spanish American War. The Confederate and Union armies lost more troops on this one day of battle than they did those three wars put together. That's how bloody this thing was. I mean, it was a huge and horrific battle. McClellan would ultimately claim victory because it was kind of more of a draw than anything. But since Lee left the battlefield, he was able to claim victory. McClellan was. Unfortunately, he did what McClellan almost always did. He just sat back and let him escape. The result was that Lincoln said, "That's it. He's an auger too dull to bore with." That's what he said. In other words, he's too dull. He's not sharp enough, to drill. So we're done with him. I'm done with McClellan. I don't care how popular he is. I don't care if he's going to run for president against me, which he did. I don't care about any of that. He's gone. And he fires McClellan permanently. You don't hear of McClellan in the Army for the rest of his life. He replaces him with a man by the name of General Ambrose Burnside, who ironically is more noted for his sideburns than he is anything else. That's how we remember Ambrose Burnside. He had this magnificent set of whiskers on his face and kind of a parabola type thing. And that's where we get the word sideburns from. So Burnside follows Lee south. Lee's on his way back south because he's whipped now, and he catches up with him at the Battle of Fredericksburg in Virginia. Ends up being just a huge, devastating loss for Burnside. He just, it just wasn't to be. The result was that Lincoln again is going to have to make a decision. He's going to have to change courses again. Now, what's going on out west? We're going to look now at out west because things are changing out west. So here's where we're going to start there. After the battles of Antietam and Fredericksburg, as these battles were being fought, there were events unfolding out in the Western Theater, that area between the Mississippi River and the Appalachian Mountains. Remember, Henry Halleck had been the commander of the Army of the West, but right before the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln had brought him back east because Halleck was kind of, remember his nickname is Old Brains. He was kind of a master strategian, or at least he was supposed to be. And Lincoln thought, well, I've got this vacancy of general in chief. In other words, there's nobody in charge of the whole Union Army. And so he decides he's going to put Halleck in charge of the whole Union Army. He brings him back east, puts him in charge of Washington, and basically tells him, set your desk and, take time developing strategy. Let's see if we can't win this war. Well, that leaves a vacancy out west. So what does he do? Halleck has to make a decision because Lincoln basically is giving the command of the army over to Halleck now. He's basically said, I'm going to be here with you, but, I want you to take charge of the army. Lincoln had kind of figured out he wasn't a military man. And so Halleck decides he's going to divide the Western command between two different generals. Probably a mistake because, anytime you divide command, you always get problems going on. On one part of it, he was going to give it to Grant, which was not a mistake. Grant had what was called the Army of the Tennessee, and he was basically in charge of Tennessee in that area, Mississippi, Alabama, if he could get in there. The other part of the West was going to be given to Don Carlos Buell, who was in charge of what was called the Army of the Ohio. The problem was neither one of them was in charge of the whole theater, and they didn't get along well. Remember, Buell was one of these that had been charging Grant with alcoholism and drinking after the Battle of Shiloh. And as a result, Grant and Buell didn't get along very well together at all. So Halleck says, he gives specific orders. He said, this is what I want you two to do. Grant, I'm going to give you 3 assignments. You're to repair and defend the network of railroads in Western Tennessee. These are vitally important to us, and I want you to make sure that the railroads are working and that we can use them. I also want you to organize occupation forces because as you're conquering territory out there, I want you to set up army units that can run these areas and make sure they don't get overwhelmed by Southerners again. And most importantly, I want you to try to capture Vicksburg. Now, that was a job, okay? When he was told he was going to have to capture Vicksburg, I'm sure he didn't say, oh my gosh, or anything like that. But he probably thought to himself, well, I've got a task on my hands here because I'm not sure how I'm going to be able to do this. Vicksburg was thought to be impenetrable, and it was the key to basically the West. If you could capture Vicksburg, you would control the Mississippi River in its entirety. And if you controlled the Mississippi River, you really had a lot going for you as far as controlling the Western theater of operations. So Grant is given these 3 tasks. Now, Buell, in contrast, isn't given a really big job. He's supposedly going to have to try to capture Chattanooga. Now, that's a pretty tough task. And as we'll find out, it really ends up being a tough task. But Buell is supposedly, he's stationed up in Knoxville. and he's basically told, I want you to go down and see if you can capture Chattanooga, liberate Eastern Tennessee, because Eastern Tennessee was a hotbed of Union support. You know, western part of Tennessee had always been Southern. The northern part, the eastern part toward the Appalachian Mountains were more sympathetic to the Union. And so he said, if you go down there and capture Chattanooga, then that's the open road to Atlanta and Georgia, and we'll be going a long way. So Buell was supposed to be trying to capture Chattanooga. So that was the four jobs that were given to Grant and Buell. Now, where were the Southerners? Well, remember, after the Battle of Shiloh and after the Battle of Corinth, Tennessee, Corinth, Mississippi, pardon me, Beauregard had just been sent packing. You remember Albert Sidney Johnston had gotten killed. Uh, and now you have Beauregard, who's in the doghouse because he just had not done well. And Jefferson Davis didn't like him anyway. So he sends him basically packing. So who does that leave? Well, that only leaves one real important general out in West in charge, and that's Braxton Bragg. Uh, he was another one of Davis's favorites. Davis had his favorites, you know, the ones that he really thought well of. Unfortunately, Braxton Bragg maybe was the worst single general in the Civil War. Now, a lot of people believe that, okay? Um, he did have one thing going for him. He had a cavalry unit that was attached to his army, led by Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was maybe the best cavalry general in the whole Civil War. That's debatable. Some people would say that's not true. You know, the Union had some very good generals there, but Jeb Stuart. But for the most part, a lot of people believe that Forrest was the best cavalry officer in the Civil War. So you got maybe the worst general in the Civil War associated with the best cavalry officer in the Civil War. Well, let's look a little at these two because they play a pretty important part for the rest of the war. This is a picture of Braxton Bragg. By the way, he is the namesake of a fort that's been in the news a lot recently. Remember, under our former president, a lot of forts were renamed because of they were named after Southern Confederate generals, and they decided that wasn't a good thing to do, and so they renamed them. And now under our present president, they have gone back to restoring the names. And Fort Bragg was one of those forts that had been, the original name has been brought back. A lot of people said, it really shouldn't be named after him because he was such a horrible general. Regardless how you might see the political points of all this. Well, Braxton Bragg was from North Carolina, and he had been the General Army of the Tennessee from 1862 on. And like I said, he is often considered to be the single worst general of the Civil War. He was not one of these wealthy planter type generals that you see a lot of in this Confederate Army. His mother was actually supposedly imprisoned for murder, and some people, in fact, say that he was born in prison. Don't know if that's true or not, but there's some people that say that. Despite his upbringing, he was appointed to West Point and graduated fairly respectably, fifth in his class. He wasn't stupid. No one ever accused Bragg of being stupid. He was a strict disciplinarian. He was a martinet. That's what they call these people like this. I mean, he absolutely believed that orders had to be adhered to 100%, no deviation. There's a legendary story about this, and I don't know if it's true or not, but it's out there. One story told that his command of a frontier post before the Civil War, it was so small that he actually operated not only as the commander, but the quartermaster in charge of ordering supplies. And as a commander, he realized that he needed to have these supplies sent to him. So he requisitioned a certain number of supplies on written orders and presented the orders to himself as quartermaster. And as quartermaster, he declined to fill it. And when it got back to the man in charge of Bragg, the regional general, whatever you want to call him, He was just absolutely beside himself. He said, "Mr. Bragg, you have quarreled with every officer in the Army, and now you're quarreling with yourself." He was, it was just kind of he didn't have a lot of common sense. Let's just put it that way, okay? It's alleged that on 2 occasions his troops actually tried to assassinate him but failed. He was not well liked. On top of that, he had a reputation for what they call snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. At many battles, it seemed like he was on the verge of winning. Shiloh, as we'll see at Perryville, Murfreesboro, he had several chances to win battles, and it seemed like every time he would mess it up. It just seemed like, just when you thought he was going to win a big victory, he somehow, through his own worst enemy, ends up defeating himself. This was Braxton Bragg, but that's who Jefferson Davis liked, and Jefferson Davis puts him in charge of the Army of the West. It does not go well, in case you can imagine. Now, like I said, the good thing that was going for Braxton Bragg was his cavalry officer, Nathan Bedford Forrest. And again, this is one of those people who, on one hand, you have to say he was a great cavalry officer. On the other hand, you have to say he was a despicable human being. That's just all you can say. And I mean, that's just the way it was. Nathan Bedford Forrest was a Tennessee cotton plantation owner. He was one of these rich planters that, was promoted up through the ranks. To his credit, when he enlisted in the Army, the Confederate Army, he enlisted as a private. He didn't go off and say, "I want to be a general." I've got political influence, I'm rich, so make me a general. He actually enlisted as a private, and he worked his way up through the ranks to general. He didn't have any military training. He was not a military man by training. He did not go to West Point. He didn't attend military academies. He was just a rich planter, but he was a good horseman. In fact, the case, he was so good that they nicknamed him the Wizard of the Saddle. That's how good he was. And like I said, he's often regarded as the premier cavalry leader of the Civil War. I'm sure people of proponents of Jeb Stuart would argue about that, but nevertheless, that's basically the way it's said. He also developed a reputation for ferocity. He was just mean. That's all you can say. He was a mean man, and he absolutely hated slaves and blacks. There's several instances where this came out. Probably the most legendary is the Battle of Fort Pillow in 1864. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But basically, he ended up massacring a whole bunch of black Union soldiers. They gave up, they surrendered, and then he basically had them executed under a white flag. Definitely against the rules of war. He was accused of shooting wounded soldiers. He was accused of burning men alive. He was accused of nailing men to barrels. He was accused of crucifying people. He was a despicable human being. That's just all there is to it. On top of that, you maybe have heard of Nathan Bedford Forrest because he is generally the man that is given credit for forming the Ku Klux Klan after the Civil War. So, he was not a good person. That's all there is to it. He was a good Army general. He was a good cavalryman, but he was not a good person. So, what happens out west? You got Braxton Bragg now in charge, and you've got Don Carlos Buell sitting here from the Army up at Knoxville, who's supposed to be headed towards Chattanooga, and you've got Grant over here maintaining Mississippi and Tennessee, Western Tennessee, hopefully going to be able to tackle Vicksburg. So that leaves kind of the open area up here in Tennessee and Kentucky. And so Braxton Bragg decides, you know what? I think I'm going to head north and see if I can do what Lee is doing back east. Lee, remember, was trying to get Maryland to come to the Confederacy as a border state. And, Braxton Bragg says, I think maybe I can convince Kentucky to break away from the Union. Actually, probably of all the border states, Kentucky was the one that was most susceptible to breaking away. There was a pretty strong leaning towards the Confederacy in parts of Kentucky. And so, there was actual hopes that you could break Kentucky away from the Union. And that would have been a really damaging thing because you can see it stretches quite a bit up into the north here, also controls the Ohio River, Cincinnati, Louisville. So it really would have been an important state had they been able to seize Kentucky. The campaign to get Kentucky by Braxton Bragg is generally referred to as the Heartland Campaign. It occurred in the months of September and October, so about the same time Antietam is being fought and Fredericksburg is being fought. The Heartland Campaign is going on out west. So let's look at Bragg's Heartland Campaign. Summer of 1862, the lower Mississippi Valley was largely in the control of the Union forces. So they've pretty much got control of the Mississippi Valley, except for Vicksburg. And, that's where Grant is kind of focusing his attention to now. That's what he's supposed to be getting ready to try to tackle. And he does in the first part of 1863. Well, Lee decides maybe it's a good idea for Bragg to head north. And so he orders Bragg to head north to divert attention away from Vicksburg and Chattanooga because he's not stupid. He's figured out that's what they're aiming to get. And so he orders the Confederate Army to head north, kind of splitting between Buell and Grant's armies, and head north into Kentucky and hopefully be able to encourage it to break loose and come and join the Confederacy. The problem was it was a great idea. And, it may have worked, except Bragg was in charge. That's where it messed up. Now, there's another general involved with it, maybe the name of Kirby Smith. So Bragg and Kirby Smith met up at Chattanooga, and there they head north through Tennessee into Kentucky. Smith is headed towards Lexington. Bragg is headed towards Louisville. Buell is kind of moving in slow motion. He probably should have seen this occurring, but he doesn't. And he reacts a little slowly to this. And Smith and Bragg get into Kentucky. And on October the 8th, Buell's army of 55,000 catches up with Bragg's army of only 16,000 at Perryville. Go back here and I'll show you again in the map here, show you where Perryville is. Perryville is right here in the central part of Kentucky. Here's Louisville over here, and Lexington, you can't see it, but Lexington's on over here. And so Kirby Smith is headed towards Louisville, and Braxton Bragg is supposed to be headed towards Lexington. He catches up with Bragg at Perryville. Well, he catches up with him and, ends up having a pretty hard fought victory. And basically ends up winning, Bragg does, a tactical victory. But like a lot of these generals, he doesn't pursue it. Buell is kind of whipped, and Bragg just kind of sits there and licks his wounds and say, oh my gosh, what have I done? I've won the battle. What do I do now? Well, Bragg and Smith instead decide they're going to retreat, of all things. They had the battle won. They had, in a sense, the state possibly under control. And just like I said, Bragg is a master of snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. It just seemed like every time this is what Bragg does. Now, Buell was highly criticized because he's like, my gosh, you had him outnumbered like 3-1 and you could not defeat him. And so basically Lincoln orders Halleck. He says, you got to get rid of this guy. I know he's your buddy. I know you like him, but he's obviously not a fighter. If you can't whip Bragg and he's got him outnumbered 3-1, then you need to get rid of him. And so Buell is sent packing. Okay. He's no longer, going to be involved in the war. He gains the nickname of the McClellan of the West because just like McClellan, he just, he doesn't fight. Well, instead, a man by the name of William Rosecrans is put in charge of what is now called the Army of the Cumberland. They switch it from the Army of the Ohio to the Army of the Cumberland. So now you've got Grant in Tennessee and you've got Rosecrans in the eastern part of Tennessee and Kentucky. So a lot of people don't pay much attention to Perryville. It's one of those battles that kind of gets lost because it's not really big and it, it's not, well, it's not what you call sexy. It just was kind of a battle. Folks, it was a really, really important battle because had Braxton Bragg won that battle and pursued it like he should have, he did win it, but if he'd pursued it like he should have and went on to Lexington or, uh, Louisville, he might have actually convinced Kentucky to join the Confederacy, which would have been a huge win for the Confederacy. But he didn't. And as a result, Perryville is kind of one of these really kind of silent turning points in the war. There's turning points in the war. Gettysburg is obviously a big turning point. The Battle of the 7 Days was a big turning point. But this was probably maybe one of those silent turning points, kind of like the Battle of Wilson's Creek. It doesn't get the attention it deserves, and it probably was a much more important battle than historians and aficionados of the Civil War give credit for. But nevertheless, even though it's kind of a victory for Bragg, it's a defeat. So this brings us now on the scene a man by the name of General William Rosecrans, who is a figure for the rest of the Civil War. He's kind of up and down. He has some really important victories, and he has some really important defeats. So let's look at General William Rosecrans. His nickname was Old Rosie. He was kind of an older guy. Graduated fifth in his class in 1842, so he had been around for a long time. He was a very intelligent man. He actually taught engineering at the academy. Remember, that was what the academy basically was in the beginning. It wasn't so much a military school; it was an engineering school. And he had been in a lot of different things. He actually was pretty rich. In fact, cases you'll find out when we get toward the end of this whole thing, he actually ended up making a fortune and actually owned a lot of what is called downtown Los Angeles for a long time till he sold it off. He was a very wealthy man. He invented one of the safer kerosene lamps, which at that time started replacing fuel oil lamps because they were so much safer. He was really a pretty unusual man. The problem was he really wasn't a combat man. He didn't have a lot of command experience. So at the outbreak of the Civil War, he was assigned out to the western part of Virginia in the beginning, eventually gets transferred out west. He performed pretty admirably at the Battle of Corinth along with Grant. And as a result, when Buell was dismissed, he is given command of the Army of the Cumberland. He's kind of a study in paradox. Nobody ever doubted his personal bravery. He was an absolute brave person. But just like McClellan, just like Buell, he was a little bit reluctant to fight. But once he did, he fought. Once you got him going, he was okay to do it. He was a very devout Catholic, and he loved to argue theology. And it was always said that he always would allow people to come into his camps of religious, spiritual people, and give missionary experiences to these people. He argued theology with his officers' corps. One of the problems is he didn't like Grant. And it's kind of ironic because Rosecrans was kind of known as a heavy drinker. And yet he was one of those generals that ironically complained a lot about Grant's drinking. There's probably a theory about that maybe he was kind of, arguing about Grant's drinking to kind of basically deflect from his own problems of drinking. But regardless, he and Grant didn't always get along. Grant gave him a lot of rope, and Rosecrans actually did pretty good at times as a general, but they didn't personally like each other very well. Well, the last battle of the Civil War in 1862 occurred on the last day of the year. the Battle of Murfreesboro, or Stones River, December 31st, 1862. As you can see up here, Murfreesboro is kind of east of Nashville. This is Nashville up here, and it's kind of east of Nashville in this area right here on the train tracks headed down towards Chickamauga and Chattanooga. And so you're going to have a big battle of Murfreesboro that's fought. And again, it's one of these battles that doesn't get a lot of attention, but was a pretty important battle. It occurred because of Bragg's failed Heartland campaign. The Confederate general had moved south into Nashville and then moved on south from there, deciding he was going to basically set up winter quarters. Rosecrans had replaced Buell, and he was ordered by Halleck to move his 42,000 troops out of Nashville to have a showdown with Bragg's 34,000 troops before winter really set in. Remember, once winter sets in, the armies don't fight very much. They kind of just basically settle in and they go into what's called winter quarters at this time. Well, Rosecrans is given an order. He says, hey, Bragg obviously is not a very good fighter. So why don't you go down and before winter really sets in, toward the end of December, go down and see if you can engage him in battle and maybe knock off Bragg's army and win a big battle here. So December 30th, they were in camp just a few hundred yards apart on a place called Stones River near the little village of Murfreesboro. There was a big incident happened that night. Remember, this is right before the end of the year. They end up having what was called a Battle of the Bands. This is one of those ironic things that occurred all the time in the Civil War. Remember, a lot of these people, they didn't really dislike each other. It's just that they were fighting for different causes. And as we saw last week, when this Confederate soldier was carrying a Union soldier on his shoulders, to go to a hospital. Well, what happens is the North started playing. They always had bands with them. I don't know if we haven't talked about that very much, but the armies usually had bands with them for morale purposes and also just entertainment and whatnot. And so anyway, the northern bands sitting on the Stones River decided to start playing some songs. And one of the songs they played was Yankee Doodle. And the South, across the river, decided they were going to kind of challenge it. And so they start playing Dixie. And finally, both sides come together and simultaneously start playing Home Sweet Home. One of those kind of cute little things that happens during the war. And then all of a sudden the troops start joining singing. Remember, it's Christmas has just happened. New Year's is around the corner. It's one of those things that's almost like a peaceful interlude between the battles, because the next day they're going to go at each other in what becomes known as the slaughter pen. So it was kind of one of those strange interludes that took place during the Civil War. The 3-day battle was just a back and forth slugfest. I mean, it was like two heavyweight boxers just slugging it out. Bragg thought he had it won after day 2, but Rosecrans, to his credit, refused to retreat. He had kind of learned something from Grant, no surrender. And so he basically keeps fighting. And Bragg, against the advice of his Army Corps, decides to retreat. And he retreats back to Chattanooga. So the Battle of Murfreesboro, also called the Battle of Stones River, ends up being a Union victory. It's also one of the deadliest battles in the Civil War in proportion to the numbers engaged. The Union losses were 31%. 1/3 of all the troops engaged on the Union side were casualties. That didn't mean they were all killed, but basically, they either were wounded or KIA, one of the two. It was a huge battle in terms of casualty losses. Like I said, one of the places that the battle raged was something called the slaughter pen. That is a picture of the slaughter pen in the background, there. As you can see, you can just almost imagine how hard this would have been to fight. This was from a diary of a Union soldier, and this is what he wrote about the slaughter pen the day after the battle in his diary. He said, "The comfort of a warming, chilled pardon me here, uh, lingers and drinking a grateful cup of coffee outweighed for the moment any consideration of danger. As all was quiet, not a shot having been fired, I walked out until the enemy's breastworks were in view, and there, sure enough, a succession of long gray lines were swarming over the Confederate breastworks and sweeping towards us, but not yet within gunshot range. Our only salvation was to lie flat as possible, where the air seethed with the zip of bullets. It reminded me of the passage of a swarm of bees. Bullets plowed through little furrows around us, throwing up grass and soil into our faces, all over our bodies, and others struck with a dull thud upon some poor, unfortunate soul. So it's a pretty vicious battle. So 1863 ends, okay? And folks, it's kind of a dismal time in the Union. They won supposedly Antietam, and they've won supposedly Perryville, and they've kind of won supposedly Murfreesboro, but there's no glory in this right now. They don't feel like they're winning, even though they have basically come out ahead of those battles. It doesn't feel like they're winning. It was dark days in the Union. They just seemed like they had military defeat after military defeat. Shiloh and Antietam, even though they were victories, were more like draws. And frankly, they were at such hard expense, large expense of troops, that the morale of the troops was not good. Things were pretty dismal in the Union at the end of 1862. They just really didn't feel good. The midterm elections had been held, and the Democratic Party had made some gains. Just as Lee had hoped, the Democratic Party had kind of made some gains into the House and the Senate. They won some legislatures, they'd won some governorships, and really only the Senate had seen the Republicans hold. For the most part, the Senate had maintained under Republican control pretty heavily. On top of that, the cabinet hated each other. Remember, Lincoln is often really given a lot of credit for this team of rivalries. The problem was they were rivalries, folks. They did not like each other. The Secretary of the Treasury and the Secretary of State hated each other, and they both wanted to be president, Salmon Chase and Edwin Seward. And they were plotting against each other on political future. They were all kind of secretly hoping that Lincoln would be defeated so they could be president. Secretary of War Stanton didn't like any of them, and he didn't even like Lincoln, really. On top of that, the officer corps was just having one of these internecine feuds. Halleck and McClellan despised each other. Grant was being accused of being drunk all the time by Halleck and Buell and Rosecrans. McClellan loathed Lincoln. Burnside hated Hooker, and so forth and so forth and so forth. It seemed like the Union generals were just going at each other more than they were the Southerners, really. So there was problems there. On top of that, you had this huge group of peace Democrats that was gaining strength by the day. Their nickname was Copperheads. That's where they got their name. They were called Copperheads. And their slogan was the Constitution as is, the Union as it was. In other words, what they were saying was, we want peace without abolition. We want to go back to the way things were before the war started. Fine, let the South have their slaves. Let's just have peace with us in charge. Lincoln, on the other hand, was on the verge of proclaiming abolition, which he will, as you'll see. And he knew when he did it, he said, I know what's going to happen when I do this. There's going to be a bunch in the North that are absolutely going to fight this. And the Army itself is going to fight it because a lot of the Army officers didn't agree with abolition. There were strange rumors, cabinet resignations. McClellan was going to declare martial law, some people said. Lincoln was going to resign, or he was going to be impeached. It was just a mess, folks. It was a dismal time in the North at the end of 1862. Lincoln told a friend, he said, we are on the brink of destruction. it seems like everybody is against us right now. So as 1862 ends, it's not, it doesn't end in the best of terms for the Union. It's not that the South is much better off, but they're kind of holding, you know. Remember, their philosophy all along has been in order to win, we don't have to lose. Now, Lee was kind of upsetting that, and he was headed north, you know, on these offensives. But basically, the attitude in the South was still all we want is for the North to stop fighting us and let us have our slaves and let us have our own country. All we have to do is to win, is not lose. And so in the South, they're not better off, but the attitude is better off. So next week, we're going to see what happens at the beginning of 1863, because 1863 is a really genuine turning point in the war. Because in the first place, within a couple of days of each other, two of the biggest battles of the Civil War take place: the Battle of Gettysburg and Vicksburg in July. And the result is that it absolutely swings the momentum of the Civil War to the Union. On top of that, Lincoln begins to kind of find his bearings. Lincoln was kind of unmoored at the end of 1862. He was just really not for sure what to do. Remember, he had gone through this personal tragedy in this year where he had lost a son in the White House. So it was kind of a hard time for the Union. But 1863, the sun is going to start shining through the clouds a little bit. It's still going to be bad times, but it's at least beginning, there's a glimmer of light for the Union in 1863. So that's it for the day. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you learned something. As always, folks, keep that mind going. Do your reading. Do something to keep the old noggin alive, because, you know, if we don't, it's going to die off on us. So we will see you next week. Glad to see you all out there. And we will start 1863 next week. Bye-bye.